For this next panel, we want to zoom out and talk about startups and define startups. What the hell is a startup? It's about speed, it's about passion, and it's about risk. And joining us on stage are three extremely well-versed people in this category. We have Carlos, the managing partner of Seed Capital, Khaled, co-founder of Plural, and Andrew J. Scott, managing partner at 7% Ventures. And this panel is hosted by Alexa Liautaud, a multi-stage investor from General Catalyst, who focuses on global resilience and backs founders modernizing critical industries. Give them a round of applause and bring them on out.
Got the graveyard slot.
Amazing. Very, very glad to be here, and glad to be here with all three of you. We'll just sort of get right into it. For us, global resilience is not just these sort of exquisite defense systems, but the supply chain, the power infrastructure. Oh, our mics are not on.
Our mics on?
Thank you.
Mike's on.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can stop shouting as well.
It's mine?
Can you all just speak
Does that work?
loudly so the microphone picks you up?
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, here we go. Let's go on and on.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, that's better.
Thank you so much.
We're back.
Great. I'll start again just by saying very glad to be here and glad to be here with all three of you, as well as everybody who has joined us. We often think about resilience in terms of sort of exquisite end systems that we see in demos, but I think we very much focus on all of the infrastructure, the supply chain, the power infrastructure, the labor and manufacturing facilities that lead up to making the production of those sort of end systems possible. And so, Andrew, I'm curious, your firm 7% recently published a manifesto on how we should not underestimate the US and Europe in terms of being able to build in complex industries, topple sort of global large companies that have existed for a long time. Share just a little bit about what is driving your conviction in some of these themes and why now is the right time for a startup to have a real impact.
Sure. So, I mean, some of you, I'm sure, remember Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator. When I watched that movie at 10 years old, there's a seminal scene at the beginning where autonomous robots firing lasers roll over a battlefield, over human skulls, and I was probably too young to watch that movie, hence why it drilled into my head. But that's the technological future we've arrived at now. That technology exists. And I think when we think about the strategies to address that inevitable technological future, there are two major ones. Obviously, the first one is to be able to fight that war, and that is having the military capability, which means innovation power, as Eric Schmidt described it, which is the ability to deploy and iterate very quickly those military capabilities. And the big primes struggle to do that. That's something that startups are very, very good at. The second one is actually to do with protection of democracy. And you have the deterrent, which is military power, but you also have the potential to use digital tooling to enable freedom of speech, to make sure that local communities are better connected to their representatives, to ensure that they're connected better to each other, because community drives prevention against polarization. And in a world which is really post-truth, we also need to understand what's real and what's not. So ensuring that people actually have access to the truth is critical. And I think there's a vast array of possibilities for startups using digital tooling, be it digitization of government, et cetera, to protect that democracy. And that's the ultimate deterrent. That's how we avoid that inevitable future.
Carlos, I'm curious your perspective in terms of, what is happening in Europe today that makes it potentially a different moment for startups to be building in potentially heavier industries or working with customers that potentially were less adoptive of technology in the past? What are you noticing in terms of a sense of urgency or why startups sort of in Europe might have an opportunity here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's the evolution of the ecosystem to some extent to accommodate that kind of trajectory for companies engaging with government. So if you think about sort of part of the question is, in effect, how's the ecosystem changed over the years, all the capital coming in, all the ideas that you can fund because you have more money. There's a line, and then there's how does that interface with local government? How has different geographies treated innovation and incorporating that into their tech stacks or initiatives? And I think that everything that's been happening geopolitically has opened that up. So it's the intersection of those two things. It's the first one is, yes, more money, more opportunities, but the second part is the world has changed and definitely means that people are more open to looking at something that changes this monolithic vulnerability that many of us have when we have one sole provider for technologies.
Have you seen a change alongside in terms of, perhaps this is a question for all of you, in terms of the types of founders who decide to go and build in some of these critical sectors, defense, sort of supply chain and manufacturing? Is there a different sort of DNA, and is there, what is calling them to these types of industries?
I think there's something that has fundamentally changed in Europe, especially like we see more and more seasoned founders and people that have already built a first company and a second company and basically honed the craft of like hiring, scaling, fundraising. And I've been able to reach a certain level of success, and when they think, what am I going to focus on next? Especially the more east you go in Europe, I think it's hard not to basically think about the looming threat that you have. And so we see clearly a wave of like repeat founders started spending time on this critical industry. I mean, Torsten, Niklas, and Gunberg from Helsing are a prime example, but like it's not limited to them. And so I do think that it's a great opportunity as well, which I think is like a secondary effect of this, to have people that have built an expertise in a lateral field and look at a new industry or an old industry in a very different way, which again is exemplary in Helsing. We're looking at it not only from a hardware-defined perspective, but a software-defined, because Torsten had built a gaming company before. And I think that brings a lot of opportunities for looking at real challenges that are evolving really fast under a different lens. Another thing that we see a lot as well is people that are moving away from academics because of the frustration on the ability to have an impact on the problems that we're facing right now. And so we see people that have incredible experiences as PhDs and working on really important technologies, but do not want to sacrifice the possibility of having impact on the real world and spinning out, which I think Europe has a lot of wealth in that sense. And for instance, like Proxima in Munich, that is a spin out from the Max Planck Institute, I think is one of the best opportunities we have to have access to fusion in the world coming from Europe.
Carlos, any comments there on just the founder profile and the types of founders that you're seeing starting to kind of heed this call?
So if I unpack your question as like a psychometric question, and I think, okay, is there something unique about the people? I don't know that it's anything different. It's all founders have a level of ambition towards tackling big problems. I think it's the context that you're in, right? And I think a lot of people have woken up to the fact that there are some industries that are monolithic and need change. And so they just some see it as an opportunity to make a change for the improvement of the ecosystem or the mission. And some people see it as a commercial opportunity and say, like, look, this needs change. It's archaic in some ways, and I'm going to make that change. But in terms of the attributes, there are almost always just two categories here. Like, one of them is somebody who comes from the system or understands the system or the industry. And they have, obviously, in this particular instance, a little bit of an easier time by understanding the relationships, the interdependencies, the role that primes play, and all these other things. And the ones that don't come from it aren't necessarily excluded from it now because of what we were discussing earlier, that there is a change in the urgency and environment, and that means that they're a little bit more, the world's more open to what they have to offer. And if you look at something like what happened with CrowdStrike recently, I think CISOs around the world are going to be thinking, do I want to have my entire thing depending on one thing, or do I want to take the extra work of working with 2, 3, 4 smaller companies that can help me provide the same service, but I'm less fragile.
I want to double click just on this concept that the world is potentially more open, that governments are potentially more open and adaptive to technology and startups. How does that change how you support companies at the very earliest stages when potentially some of the problems are still somewhat buried in siloed industries, or the warfighter or the end user is potentially thousands of miles away? Like, how do you think about, as a venture capital firms in each of your respective firms, supporting founders who are sort of working in these fields? Does it change?
Can I maybe speak about the elephant in the room here? So I don't ever promise to a founder that I can open doors for them in a sector that I don't know anything about or have the right relationships. And so Andrew backstage was asking me, do I invest in defense? And I said very bluntly, I guess I don't, because I don't represent something I cannot do to founders. But the reason why we're having this conversation and we're on this panel is because this conference is called the Resilience Conference. And resilience is a spectrum. It's everything from what provides offensively capability for a nation to defend itself, but it also provides a structure and security for our civilization within the geography that we define it in, whether it be NATO or whether you look at Western nations. And then there's resilience, which is something that every country is waking up to, is that in an asymmetric battle, our infrastructure is at risk. And there's technologies and ideas that you can back and financially invest in that cover any one of those or some of those. And I think it's important is to, as a VC fund, say, okay, where do I invest and where I don't? And for the whole industry not to judge each other on that basis, like, oh, you do this for real or you do the lightweight version of it. No, let's not judge each other. We're all part of a bigger mission, and that bigger mission is resilience for what we stand for. And then from there, you choose what your strategy is.
I think it's very right. I think another dynamic because we're a journalist fund, we invest across sectors, and our mission statement that when we started Plural was to have GDP impact in Europe, because without economic power, there's no hope that we can have self-determination. But the reality is, like, when you look at defense investments like the one we made in Helsinki, we have to look at it differently. Because there's a claim that we talk about European defense, but defense remained very much a sovereign concern. And so from the very beginning, and we got involved with the company from inception, like, it was really critical for us that Helsinki was not a German story. Even though the 3 founders are German, it had to be a European story. And it had to involve, like, people from France, people from Italy, people from the UK, which is part of Europe, but also people from Estonia and from Lithuania. Like, it's not just like Europe is more than just like the 3 main countries that people are thinking about. But that's actually a very important exercise that needs to be done at the heart, because for the hope of a European champion to emerge, it has to be a European story. And solving for procurement is still very much a challenge, not only for companies outside of Europe, but for companies within Europe. And so you cannot be naive about this, because the perspective that just building the best product or the best go-to-market strategy is going to be sufficient to see the emergence of a new prime, I think this is very naive.
I mean, our experience is it's very rarely the founder that's the problem. Founders in Europe have always had great ambition. It's been the ecosystem around them, and I think there's been a maturation of investors who have greater ambition within Europe, who actually understand the venture playbook better. And when you speak to, what value can we provide to the founders, as an early stage investor, it's normally teaching them what we know and do every day, which is that venture journey, because building a venture company is very different to a traditional business. And that's something that I think as investors in Europe have had more success, and over the last 20 years have matured, and we've seen a new generation of VCs who are from a greater variety of backgrounds than just finance. That's had a fundamental impact on the success of the startups and the ecosystem. The remaining biggest problem, I think, is depth of capital. There just is not the Series A, B, deep tech investment capital available in Europe versus the US. So 30% of our portfolio have flipped topco to the US, another 20% have subcode in the US, and that has implications for not just GDP growth within the countries that they come from, but it has implications for IP ownership, access. Europe has to ask itself a question, does it want to be dependent upon the US for general AI in future, for access to space, for all, for the fundamental technologies of the next 20 years in the same way that we've been dependent on the US for cloud compute, for the web, for search. And that's not because, obviously, the US is a close ally, but the answer is not for Europe to try and regulate its way over to control those markets. The people who regulate the markets are the people that own the markets. So, if we want to have control over how AI is used, we better build an AI winner so that we have some autonomy over that.
When you talk just a little bit about there not being enough sort of follow-on capital at the A, at the B to really follow some of these companies into the later stages and encourage meaningful R&D, where do you think, in your mind, the responsibility lies across government, across private capital, across international venture firms, local venture firms? How does LPs, how do you weight sort of those stakeholders?
God, how long have we got? I'm not a subscriber that business doesn't have a responsibility towards sort of society and wider democracy. I think it does. Business gets to make money because of the freedoms that our democratic structure provides, and therefore it's a two-way street. I think business therefore has a responsibility to ensure that it protects those institutions that allow us to operate and make money. So when it comes to why is there not more money in the system, there are some structural issues where Europe and the UK does not help itself. I'm thinking, financial regulation, the lack of consistent compliance across multiple states. I'll give you one stupid example. As a fund, if I want to go out and raise money from an LP, I'm supposed to pre-qualify them, KYC them, they're a professional investor, even before I send them my deck. In the States, you can send it to whoever you like, and you KYC them at the point they give you money, which seems sensible, right? You should obviously check who you're taking money from, but nobody's going to get harmed by reading a deck. So there's a lot of regulatory stuff which needs changing, and the politicians are saying the right things, and I think they have the right vision, but they're making some galactically stupid decisions around regulation and other legislation which does not align with the outcomes they say they want. And then on the private side, I think investors just need to be a bit more imaginative. We are venture capitalists. Adventure. We need to have a vision ourselves for what the world will look like, and back that, and not just back the latest trend.
Carlos, were you going to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to IRR. I think some of the behavior, I agree with you, Andrew, is kind of frictional points. But fundamentally, the challenge that we have with deep tech, and deep tech, this category of this conference today falls into deep tech, is that it's slower, and that affects IRR. And investors the last decade have gotten addicted to the IRR of software. And so how do you reset that? Well, you need, if you look at the IRR formula, you just need to front load some sort of subsidy. And if governments have a specific need that is communicated to the tech community, you can effectively subsidize the IRR curve and yield something similar to software. Otherwise, you're asking somebody like Andrew or any other fund to go for things that are not going to help them raise their second fund or the third fund, because their portfolio is not going to look attractive relative to somebody who's just focused on software. So I think there is a narrative here as to about, your question was about governments and how they get involved. It's like, well, how do you align those interests in a world that judges you on DPI and IRR?
How much also is it about potentially venture with all of the expectations from the last 10, 20 years being applied to some of these companies with longer time horizons? What is the responsibility of venture capital firms also to potentially think through new models of partnering with companies? I mean, we think about this at GC quite often, is taking a creative approach. We were talking about this backstage of, if we want to potentially transform certain industries, potentially it's inorganic growth. There are consolidation strategies. There are other ways to find distribution. Is that on your minds at all? Is that sort of not widely accepted? How do you guys think about that in Europe here?
I mean, it has to be, to the extent that you start investing not only just in defense or like in security or resilience, but any form of like real assets that involve venture. There is a huge time and investment that you need to evangelize other forms of like financing routes that founders can take, because they have to take them. And like taking the traditional route of just raising equity, first, it's extremely expensive. Second, you're going to hit holes in the market, as Andrew pointed out. You may have people at the pre-seed or seed stage, maybe at the A. Then there's a very big lull. I think it is changing because, to your point on the DPI and the IRR, I agree. But I think a lot of people are waking up that that pace of value creation was also hiding a lot of fragility because of that recurrence and that pattern recognition to just systematically invest in software and fintech and making sure that you get great returns. Actually, there's a reason why you're supposed to take risks and back in things that actually where you can build more differentiability. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we see more firms venture into harder problems, not necessarily because they want to do good in the world, but because they realize that the traditional model is not necessarily working. But I do agree that firms have to evolve, like applying the same form of financing, just investing equity based on the same KPIs and not exploring other forms of financing is going to lead to a lot of startups joining the graveyards of companies that can't keep raising.
I mean, we always look to back engineering risk, not science risk. And I think timing in the market, I had multiple startups as a founder, at least 3 of them were terribly timed in the market. And that was a big learning curve. So now as an investor, I look very closely at, does this fit the time horizon of a 10-year plus 2 fund? And part of that is ensuring that it is technology which is proven in the lab that then can be commercialized. Science risk is the purview of R&D labs and academic institutions. And one of the things I think, going back briefly to the government changes, I would love to see the UK government and European governments issuing more contracts to startups rather than grants, because I just think it's a terrible habit for startups to get into to survive on grants rather than actually deliver something to the end customer, which drives all the right behaviors, which drives urgency, which drives product market fit. And also, obviously, is a better use of taxpayers' money because the government or the stakeholder, be it the army or whoever it is, the NHS, will end up with something which solves a problem. So I'd love to see grants pretty much go out the window for startups, but lots more contracts be given.
Just a final question for all 3 of you. You had mentioned earlier, Andrew, Europe is often, especially in defense tech, spoken about in the image of the US, or by comparison to the US, much too often. And we actually really see Europe building for Europe and a massive opportunity here. As you think about where the specific topic areas that you get really excited about, or that you think there isn't enough, maybe they're sort of underhyped, underrated, and you would love to see sort of more founders and also partnership from potentially legacy companies, what are some of those areas that you think are particularly underrated that founders should be thinking about building in?
I think it's always quite useful to double down on things you're already good at. And cybersecurity, including GCHQ in the UK, is world-renowned. The capabilities are literally globally winning. So that's an area that I think is a very obvious one, and actually, because it's often software, doesn't have some of the capital demands that some of the hardware deep tech stuff does. If you step outside of sort of defense tech specifically, and again look at the wider resilience of society and democracies, I think one of the biggest things we're running at is the aging population. By 2050, I think something like 30% of the UK will be over 65. And if you think about the consequences of that across healthcare system, society in general, housing, that's a huge opportunity coming at us very fast, where startups could deliver real change that probably incumbents won't.
I think one of the things I'd add here is Vlad over here from a stealth company, Tom next to him, are working on tackling misinformation and disinformation. And I think, I've several people in the audience are friends, and I get insights to some extent how scary that those tools are used against our society. And in the past, we invested in a company that perhaps was too early for the space, and as a consequence, couldn't find a way to monetize. But this is one of the, information warfare in many ways is scarier because it corrupts the society from within. And so I think sometimes it doesn't look like traditional defense tech, but it has much more a profound day-to-day impact to us when it's completely out of control.
Yeah, I think I very much believe that necessity is mother of creation, and we've seen the level of fragility that we had in Europe over the last few years. And one, I think, industry that is clearly underhyped in terms of investment and focus in the ecosystem is the space industry, where we don't have spatial situational awareness in Europe. We just do not know what's happening. And we have a lot of assets. It's clearly our military capability and defense capabilities are depending on that, and yet we have to rely on other parties for this. And at the same time, you link that, we have incredible capacity where we invested billions of euros in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK in this capacity. We just need to attack the problem in a different lens. It's a supply-constrained industry with the most strategic ally of the United States and NASA for space. We just need to start approaching it in very differently. So I'm very excited to see like new entrepreneurs attack the industry.
I want to staple something to what you just said, Khaled. I think everybody here has probably read that book, Chip Wars, and that's such a fundamental element of so much of what we're talking about, and reinvesting in having diversity in supply chain. There's a European company you guys probably know, Ver, and they're trying to solve that problem, but that's just one company, and we just need to figure out how do we diversify in a critical componentry.
And to your earlier point, that resilience it's healthcare, it's financial security, it's cybersecurity, it's defense, and it's sort of the ability to move goods in and out of the country and to produce them at scale in a self-sufficient way. It can mean a lot of things well beyond defense tech. So, well, thank you very much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.